His job is to work in the shadows of government, but yet again, the Prime Minister's chief advisor is in the spotlight. Those defending Dominic Cummings' decision to drive to his parents' house in County Durham say he acted legally. Others accuse him of breaking the lockdown rules he helped impose.
Move that way, great, pass through. Can you really defend? You're supposed to be more than 2 metres apart. You're supposed to be more than 2 metres apart. Move out the way.
Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's top aide, was this morning telling photographers to follow the government's coronavirus rules. But did he break them?
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home. Because the critical thing we must do to stop the disease spreading between households. That is why people will only be allowed to leave their home for the following very limited purposes. Shopping for basic necessities as infrequently as possible. One form of exercise a day, for example, a run, walk or cycle, alone or with members of your household. Any medical need to provide care or to help a vulnerable person, and travelling to and from work, but only where this is absolutely necessary and cannot be done from home. That's all, that's all, that's all, that's all, that's all, that's all, that's all. These are the only reasons you should leave your home. You should not be meeting friends. If your friends ask you to meet, you should say no. You should not be meeting family members who do not live in your home. You should not be meeting family members who do not live in your home.
You should not be meeting family members who do not live in your home.
You should not be going shopping except for essentials like food and medicine. And you should do this as little as you can. And use food delivery services where you can. If you don't follow the rules, the police will have the powers to enforce them, including through fines and dispersing gatherings.
Well, the UK Prime Minister's closest aide, Dominic Cummings, is today facing further pressure and scrutiny, with fresh allegations that he breached lockdown rules and several members of the ruling Conservative Party calling for him to resign. Both Mr Cummings and the government have insisted that he acted reasonably and legally by driving from London to County Durham in March while his wife had coronavirus. But some Conservative MPs are now demanding his resignation. The leading Brexiteer, Steve Baker, has tweeted today that it is intolerable that Boris Johnson's government is losing so much capital and said that Dominic Cummings must go. Also on Twitter, Damien Collins said Mr Cummings had a track record of believing the rules do not apply to him, and he said the government would be better off without him. And Simon Hall MP said that with the damage that Mr Cummings is doing to the government's reputation, he must consider his position and warned that he's now wounding the government and the Prime Minister. Well, in the last hour, Dominic Cummings emerged from his London home where reporters asked him about the latest allegations.
Mr Cummings, are you going to resign? Did you travel to Barnard Castle? Is it true you made a second trip from London to Durham?
Good morning. All right, thanks. You move back out of the way. No problem.
Did you travel to
on behalf of the nation? Did you return to Durham in April? Lots of people wanting to know this morning. Did you return?
I did not.
You didn't return?
Get 2 metres.
Can I ask you, while I'm keeping my distance, how many times have you left London during the lockdown, Mr Cummings? The nation would love to know.
Did you go to Barnard Castle on Easter Sunday?
Are you going to resign,
Did you go
Mr
to Barnard
Cummings?
Castle? Did you leave the family home in Durham while you were
Is
there?
it one rule for you, Mr Cummings, and another rule for everybody else?
Do you think you're above the law? Multiple Conservative MPs have called for you to go. What do you say to them? What do you say to Steve
Why
Baker?
did you not stay in your primary residence, Mr Cummings, as the government guidelines state? Why did you go 260 miles across the country?
What do you say to
I'd love to
MPs
know.
like Steve Baker?
Lots of MPs are calling for you to resign, Mr Cummings. Will you
Why
resign?
do you not follow your own rules?
Why are you not following your own rules, Mr Cummings?
Did you
Do you have
interact with
anything
anyone
to
while
say
you
to
were in
people who
Durham
have been
outside your
self-isolating
family?
in this country? Anything to say? You have nothing to add?
Careful.
Do you have anything to add to people who have been self-isolating across this country who have
Mind your
seen that you've
fingers.
travelled miles across it? I think that's a no.
he said he doesn't care how this looks. Does that mean you don't think he cares about what people like you say, that he won't resign?
Exactly. That has always been Dominic's big problem. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about Parliament. He doesn't care about public opinion. He doesn't care about what parliamentarians think. As far as he is concerned, his mindset is that we are all the most absolute nuisances going.
Okay. Let's take a look now at the timeline surrounding the events around Mr Cummings' trip from London to Durham. So it was on March the 23rd that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced the UK would be placed into lockdown with strict limitations on travel. The government guidelines stated you should not be visiting family members who do not live in your home. On March the 27th, Boris Johnson tested positive for coronavirus. 3 days later, on the 30th of March, Downing Street confirmed that Dominic Cummings was suffering from coronavirus symptoms as well and self-isolating. A day later, Durham police said it was made aware of reports that an individual had travelled from London to Durham and was self-isolating at an address. Newspaper reports say witnesses saw Dominic Cummings in Barnard Castle, around 30 miles from Durham, on the 12th of April. Then 2 days later, on the 14th of April, Mr Cummings was photographed back in Downing Street. On the 19th of April, newspaper reports claim that a witness spotted Mr Cummings in Bluebell Woods near Durham. Well, the government have very strongly defended Mr Cummings. What do you think he should do now?
Well, I think the old maxim of when the advisor becomes the story and the advisor starts to damage the reputation of the government, whoever that advisor is and whatever the reason for the story, they need to consider their position and the harm that they're inflicting upon the reputation of the government. And I think it's very significant. I think our strong messages about social distancing and stay at home and make sacrifices and we're all in this together has slightly become diluted over all of this. And I think Mr Cummings it's now time for him to consider his position and whether he's now useful to the government. And that my assessment is that he's not.
But just in terms of the politics of it, we know he's the Prime Minister's chief advisor. The Prime Minister needs him, frankly, and may not be prepared to let him go to make that sacrifice.
Well, that is a consideration for the Prime Minister. Mr Cummings is very close to the Prime Minister. They've got a long history of a good, successful, collaborative relationship. This is, I think, an error of judgment on behalf of Dominic Cummings. If I were him, and I was as close and supportive and affectionate towards the Prime Minister as he purports to be, I would come to the conclusion pretty quickly that I was damaging the reputation of the government and the effectiveness of the government in trying to deliver these important messages at these difficult times. And I wouldn't seek to put the Prime Minister in any further difficulty. I would tender my resignation as a de facto resignation, not up for discussion, and move on, draw a line, and let the government move on as well. But at the moment, I think it is increasingly hard, if not nigh on impossible, for any of us to, with any degree of authenticity and sincerity, to communicate to our constituents and to others who want to get on with the normal lives that they are used to living, that we are still not in normal times and they need to resist, when a senior person within the Whitehall machine appears to have so very flagrantly disregarded the rules of the government.
Both newspapers also reporting that Durham police had contacted his family about a potential breach of the lockdown rules. In a statement, Number 10 said that at no stage had the police spoken to Mr Cummings or his family about the matter and that Mr Cummings believes he behaved reasonably and legally. However, a spokesman for Durham Constabulary said that on March the 31st, officers were made aware of reports that an individual had travelled from London to Durham and that officers did make contact with the owners of that address.
I think it is significant, as you say. I think 3 Conservative MPs have come out this morning and said that it's time for Dominic Cummings to go. And I'm afraid, I agree with them. We have a situation where 68% of the British people think that Dominic Cummings broke the rules. I agree with them. I think he did break the rules. And when you're a government trying to give advice to the public during a pandemic, your authority, your ability to tell the British public that it's important to obey the rules depends upon their belief in you, that they believe there isn't one rule for them and another rule for you. And so I think the way that the Prime Minister's chief advisor has behaved does mean that regrettably he has to go.
Steve Baker, this morning you've said very categorically that you think Dominic Cummings should go. Why?
Because we just can't afford to be burning through political capital like this. Neither Boris's government, Boris's programme can afford to be under this sustained attack. And I just don't see how this stops while Dominic is in post. I've always thought that Dominic should be kept out of number 10, I'm sorry to say. And I just think that this will keep rolling on and getting worse until he goes. Dominic is the inventor of these three-word slogans, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. And it's those slogans which have very, very firmly kept people at home, including, crucially, when they have children and COVID has entered their household. It's been very clear to people that were COVID to get into their household, they should isolate for 7 days for the first person and 14 days for the household. And it's a revelation that actually the government meant that it was OK to jump in the car with symptoms, to drive for hours, to get to a place where you could get more convenient childcare. Now, I don't want to judge him on the childcare, but I just would say that it's his slogans. He's been at the centre of government. He's now at the centre of this storm. And I just think every day that this goes on, there'll be more and more questions about who knew what, when, exactly when the Prime Minister knew things. And I'm afraid I watched yesterday enormous political capital being expended, with members of the cabinet going out there with quite flimsy lines to try and save him and change the papers for today. And it hasn't worked. And it clearly isn't going to work. And the Prime Minister's before the liaison committee on Wednesday. And I just think it will get worse and worse until then, and then get still worse for the Prime Minister. And the country can't afford this nonsense, this pantomime now. Dominic should go. And we should move on and deal with the things which matter in people's lives.
Do you think Boris Johnson's got what it takes to sack him?
Of course he has. He's the Prime Minister, and of course he's got what it takes. But what I would say is he'll need to learn the lesson from the Vote Leave Board and be ready to accept quite a large number of resignations, because when the Vote Leave Board quite rightly tried to sack Dominic, he'd arranged for a lot of his colleagues who are very loyal to him, ferociously so, to resign with him. And I think Boris will have to be ready to accept quite a large number of resignations if he seeks to sack Dominic. But really, Dominic should just save us all this trouble. He should go today. I think if he doesn't, we'll just be talking about this until he goes.
He insists he has no intention of resigning, and Downing Street is standing behind Dominic Cummings, despite new questions about his movements. The Observer and Sunday Mirror claim that Mr Cummings, after travelling to Durham, was seen at a beauty spot around 30 miles from where he was staying when he was believed to be self-isolating. And they allege he made a second trip to Durham from London last month, after he'd recovered from coronavirus symptoms. Downing Street said this was inaccurate. It insisted, "We will not waste our time answering a stream of false allegations about Mr Cummings from campaigning newspapers." The government had spent yesterday defending his decision to travel 260 miles to the northeast in March, after his wife became unwell, rather than staying at home in London. It said he feared he would become ill, and the couple wanted to ensure their young child could be properly cared for. He stayed in a house near his extended family in case his sister and nieces needed to help out.
It's a question of doing the right thing. It's not about what you guys think.
The government's guidance on self-isolation says if you live with others and you are the first in the household to have symptoms of coronavirus, then you must stay at home for at least 7 days. But all other household members who remain well must stay at home and not leave the house for 14 days. Ministers insist Mr Cummings acted legally and reasonably. But a former Downing Street Director of Communications thinks he should go.
There has been one rule for people in Downing Street and one for the rest of the country. That's the thing that sticks in the craw, I think, of the British people. And that's why I think Mr Cummings really should, at the very, very least, express some contrition. And I would have thought actually resign.
Helen, fresh allegations in a couple of today's newspapers. What's been the Downing Street response to those new allegations?
Yes, well, this was an investigation by the Sunday Mirror and the Observer, and they had discovered eyewitnesses, they say, that had seen Mr Cummings in Barnard's Castle, which is about 30 miles away from Durham, at the time when he was there, well, we're told, with his wife and child self-isolating. So before he returned to London, there's an eyewitness who said that they spotted him there. And of course, at the time, the government advice was that it was essential travel only. There's also another allegation in those papers that he was spotted again on another occasion after he had come back to Westminster, implying there was a second trip to County Durham. Now, Downing Street has denied that allegation. It has, in a fairly fiery statement last night, it's accused the papers of inaccuracies in these stories. Officials don't seem to have completely or entirely outright denied the apparent spotting of him in Barnard's Castle, but the overall response from Downing Street has been this was inaccurate reporting, and to very much sort of shoot back at this.
I suppose the wider problem for the government is they're trying to get people to obey the lockdown, although some of the restrictions have been eased. But whatever the rights and wrongs of this, it does make that harder, doesn't it?
It does, particularly this idea of sort of room for interpretation. And for many people who have been respecting the absolute letter of the lockdown rules over the last few months may look at this and think, well, hang on, I didn't feel I could do that. And will feel that they have suffered perhaps not seeing relatives in quite dramatic circumstances because of that. And that's the problem that the government has. But also looking forward, this week is the week where we are going to start to see, it comes up to another one of those 3-week rolling deadlines where the government has to review lockdown restrictions. They're going to start looking at what may or may not happen from June the 1st, a week tomorrow. That, if you may remember, was the date in Boris Johnson's roadmap for easing lockdown restrictions in England that suggested that we might see things like the reopening of non-essential shops. And a key part of that is going to be this track and trace programme, which launches at the end of the week, whereby people who are tested positive for coronavirus, people they've been in prolonged contact with, get contacted and told if they need to isolate or not. And the government has said everybody needs to play their part in that for that scheme to work. So if you've got confusion about what the interpretation is of what you need to do if you are self-isolating, that stores up potential problems.
What do you think is Mr Cummings' position now? He and the government, Downing Street, are saying he's done nothing wrong.
I think it's a question of when he has to go now, not if. I think his position is untenable. It's because of Dominic's slogans around these rules that mums and dads, grannies and grandpas across the country will have felt that they had to stay at home if COVID got into their families. And of course, they too care about their children, but they knew they must stay at home for 7 days for the first person, 14 days for the others. And now it turns out they could have been driving around the country with symptoms, perhaps for hours, to get to a position of more convenient childcare.
Lance, what do you make of these allegations? Downing Street are really quite robustly defending Dominic Cummings, saying that he's got no intention of resigning, he did nothing wrong. What do you make of what he did?
No, I think he quite clearly broke the spirit of the rules that were then in place from the government. And there's no doubt at all that the way in which Downing Street are rallying the troops, circling the wagons, whatever metaphor you want to use in his defence, is demeaning both those ministers who are involved in that process, but also, crucially, undermining the message that the government has been seeking to put out once the lockdown started, that these rules apply to everybody equally and that people have to adhere to them. Otherwise, they risk spreading the virus. And clearly, Dominic Cummings' actions were outside of that advice. There are two questions. The first question is, if everybody had done what Dominic Cummings did, would that be all right? And clearly the answer to that question is no. And if the answer to that question is no, then there cannot be one set of rules or one interpretation of the rules for people who work at Downing Street and another for the rest of us. And the second question is, if Dominic Cummings thought that he'd done nothing wrong, why has he spent the last few weeks, both he and his wife, who writes for the Spectator magazine here in the UK, why would they have gone out of their way during that time never to mention the fact, when describing his illness and the fact that he was so poorly, never mentioning the fact that he'd been outside of London? That shows that he knew that he had done something wrong. So I was a special advisor at Downing Street to a Prime Minister, and in in effect, the only person who could have got rid of me was the Prime Minister himself. So it's the Prime Minister who is responsible for this, and it will be the Prime Minister's decision ultimately whether he stays or goes. Now, the spin campaign over the weekend has been to try to draw a line under this and to hope that the story goes away. Well, there's absolutely no evidence this Sunday morning in the UK that the story is going to go away, and everybody is talking about Dominic Cummings rather than the important message that the government has got. And we know that that message is going to develop during the coming week, that ministers are going to have very important things to say about how the rest of us should be behaving during the lockdown and whether we could be given a little bit more freedom. Why would anyone listen to any of that advice if they know that the senior advisor to the Prime Minister, who is still in office, if he is still in office, feels that he can interpret the government's rules according to his own liking?
We've actually just got a tweet in from Simon Hoare, the Tory MP, and I'll just read it to you, actually, and get your reaction to this. With the damage Mr Cummings is doing to the government's reputation, he must consider his position. Lockdown has had its challenges for everyone. It's his cavalier, I don't care, I'm cleverer than you tone that infuriates people. That's what Simon Hoare is saying. And there was that clip of him on the TV last night outside his home, saying, I don't care what this looks like. In a sense, will that add to the pressure for him to go?
Yes, and I think that tweet from Simon Hoare is interesting on two counts. The first is that a few people now are actually breaking cover within the Conservative Party and saying that they think that Dominic Cummings is doing too much damage to the government to be allowed to stay in his job. And the other point is that he points to the fact that the way in which Dominic Cummings behaves and has always behaved, this is nothing new, it shouldn't come as any surprise to anybody, certainly nobody who watches the affairs of Downing Street and Westminster closely, does a lot of collateral damage to the government. He's made a lot of enemies inside Downing Street, inside Whitehall, more generally in the various ministries of the British government. And that means that people are not very willing, not many of them anyway, to come out genuinely in his defence. And those that do, like the quite senior ministers, very senior ministers, who were put out and encouraged to tweet and make comments in his support yesterday, it makes them look a little foolish, I think.
Let's just run through the front pages then. The Observer leads with what it calls devastating new claims that the UK Prime Minister's top aide, Dominic Cummings, breached lockdown rules more than once. The paper says Downing Street's under growing pressure to fire Mr Cummings. The Mirror says Dominic Cummings made 2 trips from London to Durham at the height of the lockdown, including one trip when his wife was ill with coronavirus symptoms. But the paper says the Prime Minister still supports his most senior advisor. The Telegraph says opposition parties are demanding an urgent inquiry into Dominic Cummings' actions, and several Conservative MPs are expected to call on the senior advisor to resign today. The Daily Mail, the Mail on Sunday, I should say, carries a quote from the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who the paper claims has fended off calls to fire his top aide by telling allies it's not like he was visiting a lover. The Sunday Times agrees that the Prime Minister wants to stand by Dominic Cummings. It says the Prime Minister has insisted he will not throw his most senior advisor to the dogs. And the Express says Boris Johnson will unveil a series of crucial moves to start steering Britain safely out of lockdown at the start of June, including funds to help the high street. Let's talk again to our political correspondent, Helen Catt. How much pressure is there now on Dominic Cummings to stand down?
Well, there's growing pressure this morning, certainly. So what we've seen in the last sort of hour or so are Conservative MPs starting to break ranks and say, actually, it's time he considered his position. Only a few so far, but a significant few. So the first one was Steve Baker, very prominent Brexiteer in Parliament. That makes his intervention quite significant. We've had a few others follow suit, some who've had their run-ins with Dominic Cummings over the years, thinking Damien Collins, for example. Dominic Cummings refused to appear before his committee when he was chair of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. So there's sort of long-running beef, if you like, there. But he has added his voice to calls for him to go. But the Conservative MPs coming out and adding their voices to this adds to the pressure that the opposition is already started to put in place here. You've got the Liberal Democrats, Labour, the SNP have all written to the most senior civil servant in Britain to say, Sir Mark Sedwill, to ask him to examine if Dominic Cummings has broken the Special Advisor's Code. And also Labour are putting quite significant pressure on to get the Prime Minister to turn up at this afternoon's press conference to answer questions. Their Shadow Home Secretary Nick Thomas-Symonds was addressed this earlier on the Marr Show.
We have had people in exactly these situations, tens of thousands of households, who've had to muddle through and try to follow the guidelines as best they can. And this particular situation was even raised at a Downing Street press conference with the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. And she mentioned things like, for example, looking to local authority hubs to see if there was childcare. And what we've not got answers to at all here is, number one, did the Prime Minister's chief advisor take advice before making that extraordinarily long journey to Durham? What inquiries did he make as to what the availability was of childcare locally in London? And indeed, on his own story at the moment, when he got to Durham, he didn't actually use that childcare at all. It was actually a family member who was delivering food. Is there a reason why that couldn't have been done in London either? These are the vital questions that need to be answered.
So that's what the opposition are saying. Well, what are the government saying in defence of Dominic Cummings?
Well, absolutely not backing down on this. The statement that Downing Street issued last night said that the Mirror and the Guardian, who wrote the initial stories, had written inaccurate stories about Mr Cummings, that today, as in yesterday, they were writing more inaccurate stories addressing these fresh claims about him having been spotted out and about near Durham. So they're very much holding the line. And you'll have seen at the press conference yesterday, Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, again sort of holding the line and justifying that. He was out doing the media rounds this morning. The problem for the government is, though, that they're now getting people like cabinet ministers having to sit and go through really minute detail, like what did Dominic Cummings do, when, where and at what time, looking at specific words in statements to say, well, did the police call his father? Did his father call the police? And that becomes confusing and quite difficult for the government, as we saw earlier on the Andrew Marr show, where Grant Shapps again was addressing some of those issues around the dates.
I have read the newspaper report about Easter Sunday, which would be the 12th. I was merely correcting the fact that it seemed to me that he may have gone up to Durham earlier than you suggested in your introduction, and therefore would have been isolated for 2 weeks, for 14 days. But look, as I say, I'm not.
Did you or anyone in number 10 ask Dominic Cummings whether he had left the house once he was up there?
And my understanding is that he stayed there in the house for the 14 days until he would have been out of the sort of quarantine period. That's my understanding of the situation.
Are you absolutely sure that he was not back in Durham, seen walking in a bluebell wood on the 19th of April?
Yeah, again, my understanding is that he's been down in London since the 14th of April and has not returned to Durham since that time.